Maybe if you're a billionaire, you're not feeling this, but most people are feeling food at the grocery store costing more, gas at the gas station costing more. Energy, price of a gallon of gasoline is 50% more than it was in 2020. It's not going down. Price of a pound of ground beef is 32% higher. That these problems all derive, people don't necessarily connect that on the spot of it. If they had only bought Bitcoin or started to read a book about it, a year ago or 2 years ago, would they know how to act? The move from 100 to 1,000 in Bitcoin, what most people struggle with the most is that, well, haven't I already missed it? I've been saving in Bitcoin since 2016, since it was about $500. I've never sold a Bitcoin. I've never bought anything else. I take my personal wealth very seriously. And it is really that everything else that isn't Bitcoin I view as not being of fundamental value, and would go so far as to say that it's the modern equivalent of snake oil.
知识的落差就是财富的落差。我真希望能更早认识 Parker， 因为早在2016年比特币500元时 ，Parker 就看好买入，并持有到现在，获利超过200倍，并认为其他所有加密货币都是诈骗，成功躲过各种币圈的陷阱。想象一下，如果2016年我们能像 Parker 一样投资，那现在会过得多自由？2020年，亿万富翁 Michael Saylor 接受采访时表示 ，Parker 对比特币的研究对他帮助很多。2023年 ，Parker 出版了新书 Gradually Then Suddenly， 在 Goodreads 上获得了105个评分，平均是4.7分，非常高的评价。同年受邀分享为什么认为以太币等加密货币都是诈骗，只选择投资比特币呢？为什么觉得通膨飙涨，比特币下跌很正常？正当法币持续贬值，为什么比特币逆向升值？最近物价、房价飙涨，但只有上班族薪水不涨。如果你正在寻找增加收入的机会，又或是如果你懊悔错过了1万元的比特币，正在纠结现在还能买比特币吗？会不会太晚？还是你投资币圈几年了，却总是赚了又赔，赔的比赚的更多，正犹豫要不要干脆退圈？这部影片吸引超过73万次观看，帮助上万人找到自己的投资方向，说不定你会是下一位。嗨，我是 Emma， 带你在币圈趋势中打造属于自己的被动收入。在我们开始前，可以请你帮个忙吗？ YouTube 后台显示有 60% 的观众还没订阅频道。如果你喜欢我们的影片，免费支持我们的方式就是点下订阅按钮，每周日都能收到币圈最新的消息，更不会错过任何的财富密码哟。谢谢。
But it's oftentimes not clear to people when I say the word Bitcoin, oftentimes people hear the word crypto. They assume that the word Bitcoin can be synonymous for crypto, so I just like to clarify that when I say Bitcoin and when I express views about Bitcoin, it's really only about Bitcoin. I have a view as to why Bitcoin will go from a nascent volatile store of value to the global reserve currency. But it is really only about Bitcoin. And sometimes people will hedge when they say, I believe that 95% of everything else won't work out, but the 5% that do will win. My perspective is a little bit different than that, and I'll help everybody understand why tonight. And it is really that everything else that isn't Bitcoin I view as not being of fundamental value, and would go so far as to say that it's the modern equivalent of snake oil. Not because I think a lot of people realize that, but ultimately because there's a few fundamental things that are baked into my view of the world, and a lot of it has very little to do with Bitcoin and everything to do with money. And so the core of the thesis of why Bitcoin is being adopted as money is that all value in Bitcoin derives from the fact that there will only ever be 21 million. That the real ingenuity, innovation in Bitcoin is its fixed supply. What it represents is a money that simply can't be printed. And there's a key principle baked into that, which is that economic systems converge on a single form of money. The reason why 100% of everything else is ultimately not valuable is for the reason that we only need one form of money. I've been saving in Bitcoin since 2016, since it was about $500. I've never sold a Bitcoin. I've never bought anything else. I take my personal wealth very seriously, and I'm here to help you guys understand why I do what I do, both with my personal wealth as well as how I spend my time. Ultimately, to kind of jump to the end point so you guys know where I'm coming from, it is that where I see Bitcoin going is from something that people think of as a stock that trades on a screen and they look at it on CNBC to a fully functioning form of money that's both the unit of account as well as facilitating trade in direct commerce. That's gas at this gas station being denominated in Bitcoin, groceries at the grocery store being denominated in Bitcoin. Everything that you buy will be priced and ultimately bought in Bitcoin. And one of the most common questions that I've gotten over the last 12 to 18 months is, I've heard that Bitcoin is supposed to be a hedge to inflation. Bitcoin's a hedge to inflation. Why is Bitcoin, quote, going down when inflation is running rampant? But first I would say, has Bitcoin really been coming down when inflation has been going up? And I say, not on a long enough time horizon. And if you zoom out, Bitcoin is simply corrected, and where we're currently at in the market is at the inception of a new adoption wave where Bitcoin will go up from multiples from here. And then second, it really is not a hedge to inflation. And there is a big difference between being a hedge to inflation and a solution to inflation. And it starts from this idea, and this is where it comes down to you guys in this room, is that there's this fundamental idea that people cannot flee to the safety of something that they do not understand. So if you might be sitting in this room not understanding, well, why would Bitcoin store value over time? If boom, inflation starts to run rampant, there's not a direct connection that helps you understand Bitcoin for that reason. It's not a flight to safety for the reason that if everyone can appreciate that no more than 1% of people have an intuitive understanding of Bitcoin, how could everyone suddenly rush to Bitcoin if very few people own it? First, people have to understand Bitcoin, people have to understand why it will store value, and then, and only then, can they use it as a solution to inflation. And so, even though the exact reason why, the fundamental reason to own Bitcoin is because it's a solution to inflation and because they're printing money and because there's CPI inflation, people don't necessarily connect that on the spot of it when they go to the grocery store and goods are more expensive, that, oh, if they had only bought Bitcoin or started to read a book about it, a year ago or 2 years ago, would they know how to act? So, the way I think about Bitcoin adoption is Bitcoin adoption happens fundamentally as knowledge distributes. As we get together in this room, as people read books, as people listen to podcasts. So it starts with how Bitcoin works and why it's valuable. So on the fundamental reason, all value derives from the fact that there will only ever be 21 million. Bitcoin only works because it's resistant to all forms of censorship. It's also permissionless. Everybody can opt into Bitcoin. Everybody can save in Bitcoin without the permission of a financial institution or without the permission of a government. What problem does Bitcoin solve? It does solve the problem of the dollar, but also the euro, the yen, ultimately the problem of printing money. You have to accept, and this is what we'll talk about today in a bit, but that the printing of money is inevitable, and it will ultimately end very badly for all of us. So how Bitcoin works, what problem it solves, because if people don't understand that they have a problem, they oftentimes look at Bitcoin as a solution in search of a problem. It is not that. And then there's a third component of it, which is, yes, people do learn about why Bitcoin fundamentally stores value because of time in the market and because of world events. So outside the Bitcoin world and then inside the Bitcoin world. In the Bitcoin world, China banned Bitcoin mining in 2021. Bitcoin did not stop functioning. That is a data point for people. El Salvador adopted Bitcoin as legal tender in 2021. That is something, it doesn't necessarily mean everyone looks up and says, oh, this irrelevant country in Central America is now making Bitcoin legal tender, but certain people figured out that Bitcoin was something different because of that. The UAE just began mining Bitcoin in Abu Dhabi with I think it's a 500 megawatt project. Nation states or city states don't just magically do that if there isn't something there of substance. But really critically, each time Bitcoin rises and falls, it doesn't die. It doesn't die ever, and that may be the most important market signal to everybody as they engage in Bitcoin and learn about it. The other side of it, though, is there's the dollar side and there's the fiat side. So there's the fundamentals of why Bitcoin works and what it's there to protect against. But when the Fed printed money in 2020, 3 trillion from March of 2020 to May of 2020, 5 trillion over 2020 to 2022. That event helps people understand Bitcoin. When Russia got cut off from SWIFT, that helps people understand Bitcoin. When Canadian truckers got cut off from their bank accounts and anybody who donated to Canadian truckers, that helped people understand Bitcoin. The bank failures of earlier this year, like things are not okay when 2 of the largest 4 bank failures in America can happen virtually overnight, and that too is related to Bitcoin. The federal deficit being $2 trillion a year, also related to Bitcoin. People connect all these things, and again, it's not to say that people look at each one of them and that helps them understand Bitcoin. It's that the more time in the market, the more people figure out that what precise problem Bitcoin is solving. So this idea that just because there's inflation in the market, that doesn't help people understand Bitcoin. Bitcoin adoption happens as a function of time and knowledge distribution. This is a log price of the chart of Bitcoin, and it simply helps people understand that when they perceive that there's inflation in the market, but Bitcoin's, quote, going down, and that doesn't jive with their understanding of what Bitcoin's supposed to do, it's really rooted in their own lack of understanding of Bitcoin. What Bitcoin is really doing is simply correcting after astronomical rise. But there's a reason why it never goes down to levels that it was at in previous markets, because more time has passed and more knowledge is distributed. This is this core idea of Bitcoin not being a hedge to inflation. In my view, it's the permanent solution. So in the knowledge spectrum, you're either at the 0 state, where you don't understand why Bitcoin stores value over time, and in that world, those people that are speculating in Bitcoin, they're trading Bitcoin to get more dollars. They have no fundamental understanding. Time is not their friend. Volatility destroys people. Weak hands are inherent, and people panic at the wrong time. So at the same time when there's inflation, at the same time that Bitcoin is the solution to inflation, if you do not understand that, and Bitcoin crashes to 16,000 and you panic and sell it, did Bitcoin help you store purchasing power over time? No. So it can't be a hedge if you have inherently limited knowledge of Bitcoin. But then, if you get to the point of understanding the true fundamental signal in Bitcoin, that it's valuable because of its fixed supply, and that it's valuable because it's a form of money that can't be printed, you start to accumulate Bitcoin because it is replacing the dollar. In that world, you understand the importance of 21 million. Time is your friend. Volatility is your friend up and down. If Bitcoin goes up and you want to sell some Bitcoin to buy a house, you can, but you also don't panic and sell Bitcoin when it drops. You accumulate more. You ultimately have strong hands. You never panic. You never sell. You buy when it's low rather than selling when it's low. In that world, it's also not a hedge. So it can't be a hedge if you don't have knowledge, and it's way more than a hedge if you've started to figure out the true signal. So these are some of the fundamentals. So I'm going to go through some of the fundamentals that are happening in the world of Bitcoin. I'm going to talk about what's happening in the world of the dollar, and then I'm going to kind of get to the end state of my economic thesis to Bitcoin. So when people see that the price of Bitcoin is, quote, crashing or declining in the face of inflation, on the left side, that is the Bitcoin mining hash rate. That chart is going up and to the right. One thing that you might notice is this dip in the middle, and that's when China banned Bitcoin. But despite China banning Bitcoin, over the last 5 years, the Bitcoin mining hash rate has increased by 9 times. There's about 4 or 5 gigawatts of power right here in the state of Texas that are securing the Bitcoin network. That is a fundamental signal that says the Bitcoin network is not just more secure than it's ever been, but that the rate at which capital is being deployed to secure the Bitcoin network is increasing at a rate faster than it ever has been before. And those projects are multi-billion-dollar projects. Those are not people buying and selling Bitcoin and day trading like degenerates. On the right side of the page is the growth in the Lightning Network. The Lightning Network, for those of you who are not familiar, is a payments layer that's designed to scale Bitcoin payments. While someone might look at it and say, well, there were only 7 million transactions in August, this is a new technology that is nascent. 2 years ago, that number was in the low 100,000s. So what's happening right now from a fundamental perspective is that people are starting to use Bitcoin not just as a nascent store of value, but as a form of commerce. And you actually have to build the technology for people to use it. That technology is out of beta, and people are using it more and more every day. A 1,200% increase in the fundamental usage of small-scale transactions like $5, $10 is a signal that Bitcoin is as healthy as it's ever been. The price of Bitcoin is also stabilizing around 27K, which is 3.5 to 4 times larger than before it dipped from 8K to 4K in March of 2020. A critical stat that we all look at, people who are paying attention to the market, nearly 70% of Bitcoin has not moved in over a year. To give context that after the crash from Bitcoin to like when it first went to 19K to 3K, about 40% of Bitcoin hadn't moved in over a year. So 30% on a base of 19 million is a lot of Bitcoin in terms of nominal units of currency that have turned into long-term holders.
我认为错过比特币赚钱机会的主要原因是，每个人永远赚不到超出自己认知范围之外的钱。像是我有一位朋友小 A， 在2017年因为 ICO 热潮进入币圈，赚了一波后就退圈，之后又在2021年因为 NFT 进入币圈，这次就没这么幸运，将几年的存款亏光了，只好再次离开。这件事他从来没有买过比特币，我很好奇为什么比特币不是币圈大哥吗？就算2017年什么都没做，只要买比特币放到现在也是赚翻了。小 A 说，
进入币圈就是为了赚快钱，谁会去买每个人都知道的比特币呢？
没想到这么多年后，多数币圈项目都失败了，只有比特币还在。这就是为什么 Parker 说，如果你不了解比特币，它就无法成为你的避险资产，更不可能帮你赚到翻倍的报酬。但是比特币技术内容太复杂，文组生根本看不懂程式码，该怎么办呢？所以我准备了一份币圈投资大地图，一次了解投资币圈的底层逻辑。为什么币圈是上班族最好的翻身机会？面对多种投资策略，新手该如何选择？诈骗这么多，该怎么避免？还把投资币圈真正获利的公式都写出来了。只要学会这份币圈投资大地图，就能帮助小资族们在币圈少走弯路，更快达成增加收入的目标。即便是新手，也能轻松上手。你可以在资讯栏的第一条连结中免费领取币圈投资大地图，不再迷茫。
I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with Sesame Street. They have this the Sesame Street segment called "One of These Things is Not Like the Others."
One of these things is not like the others.
And what I'm demonstrating here is the percentage rate of increase in the supply of Bitcoin, it both being predictable and going down each year. That's the left side. And then I show you the rate of change of the base money of the reserve currencies of the world, the dollars, euros, yen. So, and this is from 2011 to 2022. So the percentage increase in the supply of currency. So what you can see, those big spikes the last 3 years, that was 2020. That represents that the Fed created 80% more money of base money in a single year. The euro was slightly better at increasing 50%. The yen was over 20%. But this is ultimately what Bitcoin is competing against. And that each year, as Bitcoin becomes more scarce, it becomes more obvious to more people. Now, getting back to what's happening in the dollar world, because it is the problem that Bitcoin is solving. So this is the monthly year-on-year inflation rate that everyone is suffering from. The reality is, which I'll talk about, is actually far worse than this. But what the Fed and what Janet Yellen want people to focus on is that this really bad number that went from less than 2% to nearly 10% increasing year over year started to come down once the Fed started to raise interest rates. The problem is that inflation is cumulative, and what the Fed pays attention to really excludes the most important goods in the market, which are food and energy. And so what people in the market are feeling, and what all of you, it's like, I don't care if you're, maybe if you're a billionaire, you're not feeling this, but most people are feeling food at the grocery store costing more, gas at the gas station costing more. And when you look at food and energy, which are better metrics to measure inflation in the market, energy, price of a gallon of gasoline, is 50% more than it was in 2020. It's not going down. Price of a pound of ground beef is 32% higher. That these problems all derive from the money printing. Establishment economists will go through great lengths to try to explain to you every other possible way that inflation is caused, but it's all this chart. And at the same time that Bitcoin is becoming more and more scarce, they're going to have to print more and more money.
既然如此，那我们现在就去买比特币吗？且慢，投资比特币前一定要先问自己2个问题：一，这笔资金能放超过4年吗？2，自己能接受资产下跌超过70%吗？给大家3秒钟思考一下。3、2、1。如果这2个问题你无法很肯定说可以，那真的别急，等准备好再投资比特币，因为很有可能会临时需要用钱，只好忍痛卖出，或是高几率会在币价暴跌中受不了亏损卖出。
难道投资币圈一定要花4年才能赚钱吗？一定要忍受70%的跌幅才能赚钱吗？有没有今天投资，明天就稳定赚钱的方法呢？
还真的有，而且比你想的更简单。透过放贷，将资金借给交易员，每天就能赚到稳定的利息，报酬率高于股票和房地产，但风险远低于直接投资比特币交易合约。再也不用担心晚上睡觉时手机透支币价暴跌亏钱，而是每天早上起床时账户就自动多了一笔收入。最重要的是，再也不用看老板脸色就能帮自己加薪。去年我还受邀到香港分享币圈投资经历，希望能避免新手再犯下我过去的错误，不用走弯路就能在币圈投资赚钱，过上每天睡到自然醒的生活。所以我准备了一个免费教学影片，分享自己是如何从什么都不懂的币圈韭菜，到现在成功打造一份稳定安心的被动收入。你可以在资讯栏的第2条连结中找到。来自台湾、杜拜、香港等超过60位上班族们都已经达成了。下一位投资币圈赚钱的会是你吗？
And I highlight for people here the move from 100 to 1,000 in Bitcoin, because the thing that I struggle with the most at the end is what most people struggle with the most, is that, well, haven't I already missed it? A single Bitcoin costs, well, when I did this, it was 28,000. I think it's about 28,000 now. But that was the same way that I felt when I was adopting Bitcoin, right in the middle of that when it was $500. But I've never sold a Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is just as cheap today as it ever has been, because still very few people own it. And that where Bitcoin is today, 28,000, will look the same way that 100 to 1,000 move looked when 10x the number of people adopt Bitcoin, or 100x the number of people adopt Bitcoin. That people adopt Bitcoin if they find the true signal, because it's the solution to inflation, not because it's a hedge to inflation. All of that centers around a fixed supply of 21 million. And if you can start to see on this chart where there was a rise and fall, but there have been many more in the past, and Bitcoin never goes down to those prior highs and lows for the reason that it is finitely scarce, and knowledge does distribute as a function of time. More people figure it out. You don't unsee Bitcoin. And the last point that I make is that Bitcoin scarcity, while everything revolves around it, all fundamental value derives from the fact that there will only ever be 21 million. If you do not understand Bitcoin, how it works, why that is the case, why that's relevant, Bitcoin scarcity cannot be of value to you. That's why it's not a hedge. That's why a lot of people panicked and sold Bitcoin when it was 16K.
你觉得现在是买比特币的好时机吗？ A 是特价中， B 不是太贵了。欢迎在底下留言分享你的看法。我是 Emma， 还会继续分享关于币圈投资被动收入的经验。记得按赞、订阅、开启旁边的小铃铛，并打开全部，还有 follow 我的 IG 哦，那你就不会错过这些知识了。我们下周见，拜拜。